I'd like to tell you a little story, a story about a trout, particularly a trout that's called the greenback cutthroat trout. Now, I'm sure you've heard of this trout before. It's commonly fished for in Colorado, or at least some of its relatives are. The cutthroat trout is actually a group of trout that's broken down into over 14 subspecies. You may have heard of some of these, right? Colorado River cutthroat trout, Rio Grande cutthroat trout, are a couple here native in Colorado, and then the fairly famous Yellowstone Lake cutthroat trout up in Yellowstone Lake. So the cutthroat species have existed in the West for millions of years, according to fossil records. And the naturalists have divided this species of fish into about 14 subspecies. One of which was the greenback cutthroat trout. But in 1937, there appeared to be an absence of greenback cutthroat trout in Colorado. Now, the greenback cutthroat trout was native to the South Platte River Basin, river watershed basin. So that would be like the Poudre River, the Big Thompson River, South Platte River, and basically northeastern Colorado. And it was in the cold water streams, so the high mountain streams that fed into that South Platte River. And so in 1937, scientists think that that fish no longer exists. There's several species of cutthroat trout that have gone extinct over the years, and this appeared to be one of them. But in 1968, one of the reasons why they think that this species went extinct is because of the introduction of non-natives. So we could talk about how native fish have been affected over the years, and one of the biggest is the introduction of non-native fish. So up here we have the rainbow trout, of course, probably our most popular sport fish in Colorado, and then the brook trout can be really fun to fish for in our streams and very successful fish in our waters, neither of which are native. Other reasons why native fish have seen declines is changes in our water flows. We put up barriers to migrations. We put in reservoirs that change the flows, and we add toxins to our water. So we change the seasonality of flow in the rivers, we change migration routes, we change competitors, we change food availability. We've really changed our rivers quite dramatically, so it really should come as no surprise that some of our species have disappeared. Well, in 1968, it was discovered that we thought we did indeed have some greenback cutthroat trout in the South Platte River watershed. And this was really exciting right before the Endangered Species came out, Endangered Species Act. And so the greenback cutthroat trout was on the very first list of endangered species that is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So yay, we found the fish, we listed it, and that began a 30-year project, a 30-year restoration project for the greenback cutthroat trout. And so what biologists did, both Parks and Wildlife, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Forest Service, what they did was go into waters that had greenback cutthroat trout, or go into waters that could have greenback cutthroat trout, and either shock and remove the greenback cutthroat trout before you do this, or there's no need to do that because they weren't there to begin with. So they'd go in and they would actually just kill off whole sections of river of every other competing species and stock it with this newly found greenback cutthroat trout. Well, that was very exciting, and it led to the greenback cutthroat trout doing very well in Colorado rivers, in the northeastern Colorado, in the South Platte watershed. In fact, recovery efforts were so good that it was considered to be delisted, or at least downlisted from endangered to threatened on the Endangered Species Act. And in 1994, Colorado named the greenback cutthroat fish as our state fish. I mean, after all, what a success story for conservation. Well, that's fortunately not the end of the story. And so, and by the way, this costs millions of dollars. You go in and you shock rivers, you sample rivers, you poison rivers, and you restock rivers. And by the way, this picture should look familiar. Here's our speaker on the boreal toad. Remember, his primary role is as a fish biologist. So 30 years of trying to get this fish back in our rivers, and this was very successful. But then in the 2000s, a PhD student at CU Boulder came out with this idea to do genetic mapping of cutthroat trout fish in Colorado. After all, we knew there were several subspecies, and she decided to pull cutthroat trout from many different rivers all throughout the state. And ideally, what she should have found, right, was that you had similar genetic species in geographically isolated watersheds. I mean, fish don't jump between different watersheds on their own. So this gene mapping that she began revealed something kind of alarming. Instead of finding that the greenback cutthroat trout that had been restocked in all these waters and was doing so well, instead of finding that it was consistent with historical records that she pulled from museum specimens, and she went back and she mapped greenback cutthroat trout specimens that had gone extinct, by the mid 1930s. So she had these museum specimens, she had their DNA, and they didn't match what this new population of greenback cutthroat trouts genetics was. In fact, this restocked fish across northern Colorado was actually a genetically isolated group of fish that were more similar to the Colorado River cutthroat trout. What fish that occurred on the complete other side of the Continental Divide, and they looked similar to greenback cutthroat, although no one had ever really seen a greenback cutthroat, right? But we thought they were greenback cutthroat, and they'd stocked them all over the place. They'd done very well, and here we find out that they're actually Colorado River cutthroat trout. So her conclusion is that yes, indeed, the greenback cutthroat trout had gone extinct in the early 1900s, just like scientists thought back then. Okay, but that's not the end of the story for the greenback cutthroat trout. Remember how I said that when she first started looking at the genetic makeup of these fish, she was finding that the genetics just didn't really match up with what you would expect, where you'd have isolated pockets and different strains, different subspecies of fish, and genetics that were similar among fish occurred in similar areas, right? No, she was finding like similar species all across Colorado, and yet very genetically different fish in very close proximity to each other. And this just isn't going to happen naturally, right? This would take a lot of I don't know, crazy natural events for this to happen. So the conclusion there is that early on, when humans, and European humans probably, got to Colorado, they started moving fish around. And if we go back really to the first species of wildlife that we managed in Colorado, it was fish. It was really trying to get some healthy fisheries available for people in different mountain communities. So it really should come as no surprise that trout was a fish that was moved drastically around Colorado in our early I would say statehood, but actually probably before statehood. So it's not the end of the story for the greenback cutthroat trout. She comes out with this story, this biologist who's doing the genetic mapping. She comes out and says, hold up, this really isn't greenback cutthroat trout. Well, there had been stories of this fish in this stream in Colorado Springs, or outside Colorado Springs, that's actually part of the Arkansas River drainage, not the South Platte drainage. But they found they'd for years known that there was this one species of fish, the only fish that's occurring in this disconnected stream, up kind of, up into the mountains. that just was different. It was just different than any other fish, and biologists hadn't really, I guess, thought a whole lot about it. And so it took this genetic mapping. They mapped then this species of fish and found that, yes, indeed, this is the true greenback cutthroat trout. This matched those museum specimens of the extant of the extirpated species from the South Platte River watershed. So cool. The greenback cutthroat trout is saved from extinction by this one little creek. And in fact, they found about 800 individual fish in this one river. And so another researcher who worked for the for the National Park Service, I believe, he noticed, he started doing some research on why does this one stream outside the native range of greenback cutthroat trout hold the greenback cutthroat. And it turns out that he thinks that these fish were stocked in about 1874 by a prospector who was hoping to build an inn at the top of this creek. And he had a number of small ponds for his guests. So he collected and stocked true greenback cutthroats and then had protected them on his private property for all those years. So their preservation was completely unintentional, but the fact that they had no competition, that no other species were ever stocked into these waters, saved about 800 fish, and that was the entire population of greenback cutthroat trout. So what do you do with that? Well, I'll tell you what you don't do. You don't just leave them be and hope they survive another 100 years and that nothing gets into this isolated population and kills them off. So they collected some of these native true greenback cutthroat trout. They take them to the National Fish Hatchery in Leadville, Colorado, which, by the way, you're looking at this picture on the left here. This is, I think, the one of the very first, I think it's actually the oldest operating fish hatchery in Colorado. It's one of the first hatcheries that we ever had here. And it is not managed by Colorado Parks and Wildlife like the majority of our hatcheries. It's managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the exclusive use for endangered species. So they take it to this National Fish Hatchery and they say, okay, we got to try and basically make more fish, right? Propagate greenback cutthroat trouts. So they do, but the problem is that these fish in Bear Creek have been isolated for so long that they're very, very inbred. And what happens is that these fish, and by the way, in order to propagate fish in a hatchery, they don't really do it on their own. They don't spawn on their own in these systems. You squeeze the milk out of the male fish and you fertilize the eggs. You squeeze the eggs out of the female fish, strip the eggs out, and then you wash them kind of together, and the sperm then fertilizes the eggs. So they basically make fish, and we do this with a lot of our propagated fish in Colorado. And they were doing this in a way that tried to maximize the genetic diversity of the few fish that they had left, right? Like, we don't have many, so we're going to try and maximize the genetic diversity. And so they did that. But the problem is that they're only getting about a 20% survival rate. And of those that survive, there's some big problems with them. Some of them just swim in circles. They're just not very hardy. They're not a competitive, strong fish. So we've been doing this for a while, 5-10 years, maybe not quite 10 years, 5-10, somewhere in there. And they're not really reproducing that well. But we are taking some of these fish and trying to restock them into some native waters. One of those areas being very near to Fort Collins. If you are familiar with the Upper Poudre Canyon, this might look familiar. This is Long Draw Reservoir, and Long Draw and the creek slash river flowing out of it is the site for a restoration project with these true greenback cutthroat trout. So the U.S. Forest Service is leading this one. And it's one of the largest recovery projects that is currently happening. And it's using these native fish. True to form, they are not the most hardy, so it's a very expensive project and it'll take 15 to 20 years to implement. It'll cost $1.2 million, but essentially what they're doing is they're taking stretches of this river and they're killing out all the other fish in it and they're stocking it with the native greenback cutthroat trout. It'll create 37 miles of interconnected greenback habitat in Rocky Mountain National Park and the Roosevelt National Forest. And Longdaw Reservoir sits right on the northern edge of Rocky Mountain National Park, but it is in Forest Service Forest Service land. But these little stretches of river will all be isolated with man-made barriers so other fish can't get up and in. So, okay, we're taking these genetically not as good fish, right? Throwing them in a stream and hoping that they can survive because we don't have competitors. Is this what we should do in the name of conservation? Some people would argue, yes, like if you're a purist and you think that you want absolute species diversity at its finest, and this is absolutely what you should do. Others argue, you know what, you can't really tell the difference between this and the other, unpure greenback cutthroat, so why does it matter? I can fish for them the same. If I'm a fisherwoman, and I, am just interested in the catch, I probably don't care, right? Their fight is about the same. Their habitat is about the same. So it probably doesn't matter to some. So this is kind of a good ethical dilemma in conservation. Do we spend all this money to basically repopulate streams with a fish that is not necessarily likely to survive on its own? Then we throw in another potential, and that is that we hybridize the true greenbacks with the untrue greenbacks. So what they're doing there, and they've done this in hatcheries, but they haven't released them, is that they've taken these true greenback cutthroats and they have bred them, for lack of better words, spawned them with some very, very closely related genetically cutthroat trout, and I think it's a Rio Grande cutthroat trout, and they're very, very close, and they are breeding them, and the offspring survive. They have a very high survival rate. Some of the deficiencies that the true greenbacks didn't some of the deficiencies that they have, these hybrids don't have. They're just a better fish. And so some would argue, great, do that and stock them out. And then you have to ask, all right, well, if you're going to go to all that work, why do it at all? So anyway, this is kind of an interesting story of a fish, right? A lot of money, a lot of time. Genetics changed the game with these guys. We probably never would have known the difference if we hadn't have mapped their genetic code, and if we hadn't ever noticed that those fish in the Bear Creek stream were a little bit different. They may not have ever, ever found the greenback. They may have thought they were indeed extinct, and more than likely that little population would have gotten wiped out somehow and we wouldn't have known. So it's just a fun story. I thought I'd throw it out there. It really speaks to both natives and non-native fish and the efforts that we put forth to try and keep what we once had. All right, hope you enjoyed it. Not quite as good as hearing from Rich the man, but it's at least something.